감사합니다. So this morning in the keynote, I spoke a lot about developing applications with Firebase and some of the technologies that were available for developing applications with Firebase. So what I want to share in the next 25 minutes is an example of an application that I built using Firebase. It was originally an application that used cloud. My slides aren't advancing. So it was originally an application that used cloud, and I changed it to use Firebase. So the application itself is a game that I call Rescue Me. And the idea behind this game is that it's a game that you play in augmented reality, so that there are a number of locations in the real world that you have to go to play a stage in the game. And then once you're there, I thought it would be really interesting that if you could customize your experience. So for example, I'm visiting Seoul. I haven't been to Seoul in about 5 years. And it would be really fun if I find my 3 favorite locations in Seoul, and I create a game around those 3 locations, and then I share that with other people in Seoul. And it doesn't have to be limited to what I like. Maybe you are playing the game and you find 3 places in a city or in a country, or if you want to make it challenging, in 3 different countries, where the person has to go and finish all the stages of the game. So the idea behind this was that that's a very customized experience that I would then share with my friends. And the game is built around this interactive character, as well as working for Google. I'm an amateur filmmaker, so I just used some of the characters from a CGI film that I've been working on for doing this. So here's an example of what the architecture for an application like this should look like. Now, if you were building this on the web, you would build something like this to have the data for the 3 locations that you want the game experience to be in, stored in a database, such as what's on the right-hand side of this diagram. Now, if you are doing this and you want to provide that kind of access, then you need to build some kind of a service around that database, which writes to the database and reads from it, allows you to edit it, update it, maybe remove records when you don't want them. And then in order to use that service, you'd usually need to write some kind of an API or a service tier that your mobile application would talk to through the internet. So all of this architecture, this whole middle band that you can see in the diagram here, is something that you typically have to write yourself, build it in PHP or Java on the back end or something like that. And it's a lot of work that you'd have to do. In addition to that, for a game such as this one, I said it uses real-world locations. So Google have something called the Places API, where the idea behind the Places API is that over 100 million real-world places are stored in a Google database along with metadata about those places. Now, those places are the typical places of interest, such as the location that we're in right now, or shops, or bus stops, or train stations, or those kind of things. So instead of you needing to think about the world in terms of latitude and longitude, you can think about the world in terms of places. You know, maybe step 1 in my game is to go to the DDL here in Seoul. Step 2 would be to go to a hotel in Seoul, and maybe step 3 would be to go to Incheon Airport. And instead of me specifying this as a latitude and a longitude, I want to specify it as a place. So the second thing that my game would have to do is consume places such as this. And then the third thing is that this character, you're going to interact with this character throughout the game. So what I did was I rendered lots and lots of sequences of this character talking to you, giving instructions, responding to you, stored them all on YouTube, and then there's a YouTube API for being able to talk to them. So here's what the architecture would look like. It's very complex. Now, the second thing is, when the architecture looks like this, you need API keys in order to talk to YouTube and in order to talk to the Places API. Now, if you distribute those API keys in your application, somebody could reverse engineer your application and take your API keys and then start calling the Places API or start calling YouTube with your keys, and potentially you lose a lot of money from that. So the next thing, like usually in a service like that, is that you want to store the API keys safely on your web service so that they're not being distributed with your application. But then you're faced with the problem of, well, how do I stream from YouTube through my service all the way down to my application? Or how do I use the Places API through my service all the way down to my application? That's a lot of work as a developer that I'd need to do. So when I first built the application, this is what it looked like, except for one thing. Instead of putting it on the web, I put it on the cloud. So with the Google Cloud Platform, there are a number of things that you can use. There's the Google Cloud endpoints that you can use for the API. There's the Google App Engine that I could use for the service. And then there's various storage technologies such as Google Cloud SQL. So I go, okay, this is great. Now instead of maintaining the infrastructure myself, all I need to do is outsource it, and Google will maintain the infrastructure for me in the cloud. But that doesn't take away the complexity that what I want to do is something pretty simple. I want to be able to store 3 locations. I want to be able to put an ID on those 3 locations. And then if I tell you that, hey, try playing this game in Seoul, here's the code, then the game would read those 3 locations based on that code. So this is a lot of infrastructure that I would need to build to do that very simple task. So I thought, what about Firebase? And here's how Firebase will work with it. So now if I use Firebase's remote database functionality, real-time database functionality, all I have to do is use code in my application to write the data to Firebase, to read the data from Firebase, and to like edit, update, all those kind of things with the data in Firebase. Don't need to worry about all that infrastructure. And I can now start putting my API keys back into my application because I can use something called remote config. So instead of storing the keys in my application where they could be stolen by somebody reverse engineering the APK of my app, all I have to do is store my API keys in Firebase, store them in the remote config. If you were here in the last section, Doug was talking a little bit about remote config, and I'll demo it in a moment. And now my application can read them from Firebase, can call YouTube, can call the Places API, and I don't have to worry about anybody stealing them. So it makes my application a lot simpler, it makes my architecture a lot simpler, and arguably it makes it more secure. So I spoke about the real-time database this morning, and just if you weren't here, just a little reintroduction, is that it's a NoSQL database, it's stored in the cloud, and what it does is it gives me synchronization across all my devices, conflict resolution across all my devices. But for the app that I'm writing, and to make my life a lot easier in building this game, is it allows me to access the database directly from my app. I don't need a service, I don't need an API tier, I don't need like connections to a database. I'm writing code that runs in my app rather than runs in the cloud, and what this code does is it writes and reads from this cloud-based database in real time. So let's take a look at a demo for this. So if I switch over here to my device, okay, we can see that I have I'm just going to open something on my laptop for a moment. So we can see that this is the opening screen for my game, and I've given 2 options. Number 1, I can create a new game, or number 2, I can use a predefined game. So if I'm going to create a new game now that I'm here in Seoul, what I'm going to say is, okay, I touch that, and it gives me 3 options, like for location 1, location 2, and location 3. I'll touch location 1, and this control that I'm using is called a place picker. So as part of the Places API, there's a control that you can drop into Android applications called a place picker, and it's determined that I'm here at the Dongdaemun Design Plaza, and I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to make that my first location in my game. So somebody playing the game, they would have to go to the Design Plaza first, play a mini game, then go on to the second location, and let me pick something nearby. This looks like a hospital, so hopefully I got that right. And then I'll pick my third location, and I'll just pick something at random, the History and Culture Park. So now I have my 3 locations. So I'm going to switch to my real-time database. And when we talk about it being a real-time database, you'll see it's actually in real time. So the next thing I'm doing on the mobile is I'm just going to give the game a code. You can't see it right now, but I'm just going to call it stage. And I don't have an existing stage, and I'll press OK, and you should see that the database will update. There it is. You see that yellow flash? That means the code that I've just written on my, that I've just executed on my phone ran on here to give me the 3 locations, and we can see it's the 3 locations that I picked a moment ago. And there's a description for each of these locations, and then there's this string, and this string is the identifier for that location in the Places API. So now if I'm going to play the game, I'll switch back. So now if I'm going to play the game, I'm going to use a predefined game. I'm going to pick a game. So now if I had shared this with my friends and said, hey, if you want to play it around the Dongdaemun Plaza, you open the game and use the code stage. So now just type in the code stage. And the game will begin, if we have sound.
Hello? Hello? Oops. Is there anybody out there? Hello? Hello?
So here's this character. She's stuck in a parallel universe. She needs to come back into our universe, and she's going to direct you how to do that. But it begins with her asking, is there anybody out there? Can anybody hear me? And I'll say, I'm here.
Great! I thought I was going to be lost forever. Can you please help me?
So she's asking for some help, and I'm a nice guy. I'll say, yes, I'll help.
There was an accident. I'm trapped in an alternate dimension, which is literally right next door to yours. Parts of my dimension are leaking into yours, and if you can get to their location, I can fix it and get myself home. The first part is here. Please go, and I'll let you know once you're close enough.
So what she's doing, she's just explained the situation of the game, and you can see at the bottom of the screen, because of the location that I picked, it's telling me to go to this location. I will say okay, and now she'll start scanning to see if I'm there.
I see you are scanning for the bridge between our dimensions, but you aren't close to it yet.
So I'll drop out of that for a moment. But here she's just scanning, she's looking to see if I'm there, and then she would launch me into the next part of the game when she detects me. All right, so I'm going to switch back to slides. Sorry, it takes a moment for them to load. Okay, so you see this demo is just me creating the game, storing the game in the real-time database. And this is an example of what the real-time database looks like. My OK Google just picked up. And this, again, was an example of what it looks like in the real-time database. As you can see, it's a pretty straightforward structure, how the database works. You just have a tree-type structure. And in this case, I have a node called game locations. And under that node, then, I have a number of locations specified by a code. So the top code here was home. And these are 3 locations near where I live, and including like the location ID for them. And then the second one was last week I did this demo in Yokohama in Japan, and you can see I just used the code YOK to determine 3 locations in Yokohama. And again, if you were playing this game, you pick locations, you pick a code, and then you share. So this is what it looks like to write data using Firebase and to be able to write the data to the database that I did. Now think about that architecture diagram that I began with, where I had a service tier, I had a database, and I had an API, and I needed all of these things to be able to store data in my database. Now, in Firebase, this is all I have to do. So the first line that you see here, game code, is just, as you saw when I was using the Android application, it gave me an input box, and whatever the string that returned from the input box is going to be game code. So then my second 2 lines are, I create an object called a Firebase database, and then I create a database reference on that to look for the place called game locations. So if you remember on this slide, right at the top, I have game locations, and all I'm doing is getting a reference to that. So then on game locations, the first child is going to be the game code. So when I was demoing it here, I set my first child to be stage, and you set its location 1 to be a value. You set its description 1 to be a value. And you do the same for location 2, location 3. And then you end up getting something like this stored for you with code that was as easy as this. So compare that to what you would have to do, even if it was in the cloud, in building something running on the service tier, writing to the database, connection strings for the database, and then an API tier surrounding that so that your mobile application can consume that over the web. This is all I had to do instead. Very, very simple. Reading data is just the same. So in this case, I create a Firebase database object. I create a reference to that, and that reference is pointing at the game locations. And again, remember, game locations was right at the top of the diagram that you can see here. And then once I have game locations, the Firebase database is really interesting because it is an asynchronous model. It's not like SQL, where you run a query and you get results back. You ask it to do something, and it will give you a callback. Or if you set up to listen for changes in the database, it will give you a callback whenever those changes occur because it's a real-time database. But one other thing that you can do, and it's the line of code here, on my third line, is where I say add listener for single value event. What that does is that's going to give you an instant callback with the details for that, and it's only going to do that once. So this is perfect for me to initialize my game, where I just say, give me, for the game code, for game locations, game code, give me the contents of that and give them to me once. And it will give them back to me once, and then as you can see, they will come back in an on-data change callback, and in that callback, I can then start reading that into memory so I can then use it in my application. So using it in my application, as you saw when I was demonstrating it, it showed the location at the bottom of the screen, and then for the Places API key for that specific location, then I can use the Places API, call that, and ask it, am I at this location, yes or no? And as a result, this is all I have to do to read my data. It's pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. So the next thing is remote configuration. Now the idea behind remote configuration is that remote configuration allows you to store variables for your application on the server instead of storing them within your app. So there's 3 places in this application that I'm using remote configuration. 2 of them are for my YouTube API key, because when you saw those videos a moment ago, they were playing off of YouTube. And the second one is for my Places API key. So then as I'm scanning to see if I'm in a particular place, I use Google's Places API for that. I need a Places API key for that, and I store that on the server. And then the third one is a locale for the application itself. So what I'm going to do in this case is, it's not a great way of localizing it, but as you can see in the middle here, I say the locale is the USA. What I've done is I've gotten the same videos for the same animated character, but I got her to speak in Korean instead of speaking in English, and I can change her to speak in Korean by making one change in my Places API, in my remote configuration. And I'll show you how to do that. So this screen that I've been in, this is the Firebase console, and as you can see right now, I'm looking at the real-time database. But what I can do is I can go to remote configuration. And my Wi-Fi is a little slow here, so just give it a moment. But when I'm in remote configuration, you'll see those 3 variables that we spoke about. Here they are, my YouTube key, my locale, and my maps key. And I'm going to change my locale to Korea. It's always worrying doing a live demo. And then once I've done that, I publish the changes. So I'm just going to publish those changes. So now I've set this remote configuration variable to read Korea. And I've written my application so that if it reads the remote configuration variable as Korea, then my character will speak in Korean instead of speaking in English. So let me start my app. I will switch. So I'm going to start my app. I'm going to use a predefined game again. I'll just do the same one. The code was Soul. No, sorry, it was Stage. Press OK. And now when the game begins...
저기요? 여보세요? 아무도 안 계세요? 여보세요? 여보세요?
Can you understand her? Oh, good. I didn't localize the buttons yet, so I'll just say I am here.
계셨네요. 영원히 여기 갇히는 줄 알았어요. 저 좀 도와주실래요?
So she's saying, hey, will you help me? I'm nice, so I'll say, yes, I'll help.
사고가 있어서 다른 차원에 갇혔어요. 여러분 있는 차원 바로 옆에 존재하는 차원이죠. 우리 차원의 일부가 여러분 차원에 열려 있어요. 그곳에 가주시면 제가 차원을 고쳐서 집으로 돌아갈 수 있어요. 우선 거기로 가주세요. 그 장소에 가까워지면 제가 알려드릴게요.
And it just goes into the same thing, and now she's scanning to see if I'm here. But that shows
좋아요.
how...
당신은 지금 두 차원을 잇는 다리를 스캔 중이시군요. 하지만 아직 좀 멀리 떨어져 있어요.
So just to exit out of that, that just shows the power of things that you can do when you store a server variable in the cloud. Now, localization, it may not be the best way of doing it. This is just a gratuitous demo. Localization, you might want to say, have her speak in Korean if you detect the phone is in Korea. And analytics can be used for that, as well as other technologies. But this to me is a great example of, by changing something on remote configuration, I can change my application very quickly. Another example of this would be, as I'm showing here in remote configuration, I have API keys for YouTube and for Maps. Now what would happen if I have a quota on these and I hit that quota? Now typically, if I've distributed the API key in my application and I've broken my quota, the application will stop working and people will start getting crashes. But if I'm reading them from a remote configuration and something like that happened, all I would have to do is change my key in remote configuration to a new key with a new quota, and then the app will be able to read that and get it working right away. So as a result, with remote configuration like this, I'm able not only to do things like a gratuitous demo where I can make my character speak in Korean, but I can really start tweaking how my application will operate, and it will make my life a lot easier as an application developer. And then the third and final thing that I want to show is that while I was building this out, I had a number of crashes when people were testing it. And if you're here for the previous session, Doug was talking about crash reporting, and I just want to show this actually running. Sorry, it takes a moment for it to load up. Here we go. So now we can see this was from some friends of mine testing this last week, where there were only a few people using this. It hasn't been published in the Play Store yet, so I don't have thousands of users. But you can see here on the crash report some of the types of crashes that I had. And if I click on this bottom one, I hope you can read it on the screen. Here was an example of where my application crashed because it failed to read an API key. We can see here Java lang illegal argument exception. The developer key cannot be null or empty. Now what had happened was somebody started using my application. She was using it offline. She didn't read the API key out of remote config. She launched the application. She tried to read places from the Places API or access videos using the YouTube API, and the application crashed. Now this was something I hadn't foreseen, and the results that she just told me was, I launched your application and it said it stopped. How do I debug that? I had no idea how to debug it, but I can come into crash reporting like this, and I can see when this test was going on that in her case, she didn't have the developer key, and I found out that she wasn't connected, so I was able to rewrite my application to fail gracefully if you aren't connected. So this is just an example of some of the technologies that are available in Firebase, for you to build as an application developer using hopefully a real-world scenario. And so in this one, I used the real-time database in order to store the locations where people would play the game and the codes that they would use to share those sets of locations with their friends. I used remote configuration to store variables such as API keys that I would not want to distribute with my application. And I also used remote config to set a variable to change the behavior of the application, in this case changing the character from speaking English to speaking in Korean. And then finally I was able to use crash reports so that I can see where my application was failing and how I can fix it. So hopefully this is something that will be of use to you, and if you're looking at using Firebase yourself, hopefully it's something that will be inspirational to you. One of the neat things about Firebase is you don't have to use all of it. You can pick and choose what works for you, and in this case I picked those 3 technologies. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.